thing that you need to know is that if you've met one person who is neurodivergent, you've met exactly one. So we need to consider that much of what we think about, much of what we think we know about interpreting other people's actions may be wrong. It could completely change the way that you connect with others as a neutral.
Welcome to Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. Today is October 16th, 2025, and it's great to see you all. We have a very special guest here today, Laura Anthony, who's a disability attorney with Bricker Graydon. And before I introduce her, though, let me get to the part that my co-host Jeff Kachavin always says is his favorite part of the program. How much it is that we've been told of that people have donated to food banks in honor of our special guests. Because as you know, there is no charge for these programs. And if you don't know, let me tell you, there is no charge for these programs. We've been having them since this program was founded back in the spring of 2020 by Natalie Armstrong Motan during the pandemic as a way to give back. And here we are still going 5.5 years later. So it's a pleasure. And today doing the honors, we've got David Schraga.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thanks to our gracious audience for being here, and a special thanks to Laura Anthony for supporting us today and bringing in such a fantastic audience. The number today, as of today, we have raised $883,616.41 that we have been told about. So it's really fantastic. You know, there's a multiplier effect for every dollar. It's multiple meals. It's millions of meals around the world. So thanks everyone for their gracious support, and thanks for being here today.
Yes, and thank you, David. We don't handle any money for any of those who are new to the program because you want to hear Laura speak today, and we'll get through this really fast so you can hear her. We ask that you let us know whatever amount it is that you might have made in a donation. You can let us know on the website. There's a link you can hit, or you can email, you can chat with Natalie during the program, chat with myself or David, and we'll be happy to add it to our running total. And that would just be great. The website address is willworkforfood.news. Willworkforfood.news. Okay, and this week's suggested food bank by Laura is the Worthington Resource Pantry. She'll mention that to us, and then the link to it will be put in the chat. So easy peasy for making a donation. That said, let me get back to introducing Laura. As I mentioned, Laura is an attorney. She's with Bricker Graydon, and she's going to be here today, or she is here today, to speak to us on different wiring, shared solutions, why understanding neurodiversity can help you resolve conflict. Imagine conflict resolution is tuning a radio. You know, we each speak differently, hear differently, and we're all on different frequencies, that's for sure. Our brains work differently. And so with Laura today, she's going to provide us with some practical tools for spotting sensory triggers and decoding non-literal language and understanding dialogue. Laura is a nationally recognized speaker, disability attorney, and consultant with an extensive background in neurodiversity, including leadership and dispute resolution. For over 25 years, she has led a neurodiverse team and helped businesses and organizational leaders understand the differences in how people think, process, and communicate. As a certified mediator and investigator, Laura has also been at the forefront of neuro-inclusive conflict resolution efforts, training professionals on how to implement practices that are effective, affirming, and trauma-informed. And beyond her professional experience, she brings a deep personal connection to her work, being the child of a parent who suffered a brain injury. And so she spent her whole life basically in this field, navigating the realities of neurodiversity and this coupled with her studies and all of that. So we are sure to learn a lot today, and I'm looking forward to your presentation, Laura. Thank you so much for being here. If you don't mind saying a few words about your food bank, and then the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jean. So the Worthington Resource Pantry is just down the street from me. So when we talk about local impact, this is one that is I'm connected to the law firm where I work. We have folks on the board, and they I think are unique in the resource pantries in that they do food and much more. And one of the things that I do love about the resource pantry is that they have a lot of fresh food, a lot of healthy options, as well as having a delivery service for folks who can't get to the resource pantry. So they really have a huge community impact in the way that they serve folks who are in need. And so I'm delighted to have a way to give them more resources for the resource pantry.
That's great. Thanks so much. And Natalie will be putting the link to the pantry in the chat for us.
Terrific. All right. Is it on to me? I will then share my screen. All right, here I am in my presentation. So I want to start with, and Jean mentioned this about different wiring in the sense that we all have different frequencies, but we also all show up in different ways to things that could be viewed as stressful. So let's think about the funeral analogy. When we show up to a funeral, we see people who have differences in the way that they're showing up. Some people are laughing, and some people are crying, and some people are huddled in the corner, isolating, and some people are hugging everybody. But when we come to that funeral, we're all pretty open to the idea that everybody's showing up grieving, but just in their own way. Not wrong, but in a different way. And so there's what you see at a funeral is often divergence in grieving. So my topic is on neurodivergence. It's differences not on how we grieve, but how we process information and how we communicate information. My hope is through the session, you'll be able to better navigate those differences when you encounter individuals whose brains process and communicate in ways that you might not expect. So we just need to think differently about thinking differently, and hopefully you'll see some of those strategies, because what I do, and so I thank you, Jean, for that nice intro. I have been living in a space of helping individuals who are neurodivergent since I was in elementary school. My mom had a traumatic brain injury when I was a child, and I learned very quickly that the world isn't built for brains that work in ways that we don't expect. And today I help communities and organizations grow by teaching leaders and people who are navigating conflict how to navigate and really embrace and expect those differences. But this isn't just for conflict resolution, because whether I'm conducting a mediation, or my team is neurodiverse, or I'm leading a team, or teaching a class, or maybe even showing up for somebody in your family, learning how to support, not only support, but to celebrate different ways of thinking can lead to better relationships and better outcomes in whatever you're navigating, if it's conflict or not. But before I tell you how to do that, because I'm a lawyer, I have to have some disclaimers. So I need you to understand my background and my bias. So again, have been living in this world even before the term neurodiversity was a thing. But I'm not a brain scientist. I am not a psychologist. I'm just a lawyer and a mediator who's been surrounded by neurodivergence for most of my life. So my goal is to approach this topic with as much respect, but I also with as much acknowledgement that there's a lot of different preferences about terminology. Some people want to focus on a person-first identity. So you might say a person who identifies as neurodivergent. That's a person-first language. Some might say a neurodivergent person. So understand that there are differences, just like differences in grieving and differences in thinking. There's differences in the way that language is preferred in that respect. My paralegal is autistic. She wants to be called an autistic person, not a person with autism. So know that there are differences. And as somebody who is a neutral in your neutral work, you're going to want to ask about preferences. But my disclaimer here is that I'm going to use identity first language, because that for for those that I know in my life, that is their preference. The other disclaimer is this is part of a series of talks, and particularly on the conflict resolution piece that is more than 90 minutes long. And so when I do workshops on this, it's longer than what we have time for today. So just know that the PowerPoint slides are not comprehensive. This is part of a larger training that I do for corporations and education institutions. But just know that there's a lot of dense stuff in the PowerPoint. I just can't say everything in the time together, and a lot for questions. So I want to introduce you to some threshold concepts that hopefully will orient your work in this respect. But first, I want to, this is the audience participation part, throw some chats. This is some initial questions for you. So are you familiar, and I could love to see yeses, nos, whatever you want to put in there. Are you familiar with the term neurodiversity? My next question for you would be, do you know someone who identifies as neurodivergent? And then the last question, I'm seeing all these yeses pop up, nos, and both yes, oh, yes, yes, and yes. Here's a third one. Do you know that person well? All right, so much personal conversations. I'm looking at the chat. So I want to say congratulations if you do have somebody that you know who is neurodivergent. So if and the thing that you need to know is that if you've met one person who is neurodivergent, you've met exactly one. And that is because the word sets the expectation, divergence. It is different ways of thinking and communicating and recalling information. So if you've met one person, let's say one person with autism, you can't predict how another person with autism is going to show up or think or communicate or recall information. It is a spectrum for a reason. Now, while you can't predict, you are more prepared. And so this training and talks like this can broaden your lens. And that lens being broadened helps you meet people where they are, whether that's in the workforce, whether that's in a mediation, whether that's in the community or your family. The work is about recognizing and accepting. Well, I said accepting, it's actually really expecting that people don't think and communicate in the same way. And the reason for that is because great minds just don't think alike. That is a truism that I like to say. But know that neurodivergence this is not a medical term. Okay, it's a term that not a term that equates directly with disability. Instead it's a way to reference differences in how our brains develop over time and how they function. But it's a difference and not necessarily a deficit. I like to say that it's a distinction, to be honest with you. A lot of people ask me about the word divergence and how that is suggesting that there is diverting from a proposed norm. And so I would like to be called distinctive versus divergent, but that's just me. I am not in charge of language here, but I would say it's not necessarily a deficit. It's not necessarily a disability, but recognizing those differences is the first step to navigating them and to accommodating them. You know, if you look on social media and you type in the word neurodivergence, you are going to get all kinds of people talking about, ADHD hacks for your brain or different ways to process information and deal with those distinctions. So it is very popular to talk about neurodivergence, and I always like to hear firsthand accounts. There are firsthand accounts from, because that tells me and that informs me that great minds don't think alike, divergent minds don't think alike. And so we have to set that up as an expectation. So quickly, I want to go through some of the common distinctions or common differences that might come up in a workplace conflict. It might come up in a conflict within a family. Those common differences are in different categories. So I'll just, for time's sake, focus on learning processing differences. You might see somebody with dyslexia. They might have a difficulty processing reading material. Dysgraphia, that's difficulty producing written work. And dyscalculia, which is difficulty processing and learning math. So number calculation. There may be a difference in processing attention or different ways of focusing. And it's not necessarily the ability to focus, it's really about the ability to filter what is distracting in the environment so that you can focus. Now we are, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we are all filtering right now. You might be filtering the fact that I have curly hair, and when I put myself in the PowerPoint, it kind of pixelates because I have curly hair, and that could be very distracting to you. You might be focusing on this plant behind me. Like there might be distractions. We all filter all of the time. And if you cannot filter and everything is at a heightened level of distraction, it's harder for you to focus. So those are differences in focus. And then the differences in emotional regulation. Because of those distinctions, people can be overwhelmed by the constant filtering or the constant stimuli. And so sometimes that can lead to dysregulated emotions, shutting down behavior, withdrawing behavior. I forgot to say at the very beginning in my disclaimers that I will take questions throughout. And Jean and Natalie and David have kind enough to monitor the chat because I can't see the chat right now. But just know that I will have natural breaks in this, but don't hesitate to ask questions as we go along. But I will leave some time for questions. Another distinction that often comes up in the area of neurodivergence is autism spectrum disorder. Lots of variation in the ways people communicate and interact, the differences in behavior and interests, differences in how people prefer to engage in activities. And it was once thought, well, and some people currently still do think this way, that autism is a linear spectrum, meaning you're low functioning or high functioning. Really, the wheel concept has become a lot more popular and a popular approach to describe somebody's experience, since it focuses not just on are you low functioning or high functioning. It looks like different factors can be low or high level depending on the circumstance. So you can see here a wheel, and then maybe this is a person who has high difficulty at regulating their emotions, but they're really great at communicating. So looking at things like how are they processing information, what are their motor skills, what is their preferences for social engagement, and then what sensory triggers are they seeing, or are they experiencing in the environment. So there's different degrees to which somebody who's neurodivergent might experience each of these traits. Now, some of these things may look no different than somebody who's not neurodivergent on a good day. You know, they're great communicators. They seem to be fine with social interaction. They're processing information in a way that you might expect. But if they're in a crowded space, they might shut down in conversation, or they're in a space where there's a lot of other sensory triggers, or, and this is for us as mediators, when they are in stress and under conflict, they might have more difficulty processing information or communicating their thoughts, their needs, their interests, or they might be dysregulated in their emotions. So this reflects that, again, great minds don't think alike. Not every autistic person acts the same way. They are capable of varying strengths and weaknesses, just like anybody else. Now, I had an experience last week. I took my child to a concert, and there was a lot of sensory overload in that environment. I am not 15 years old. Those, everything that was going on in that environment was giving my brain a lot of overload. And so when you think about the stress that is created within conflict, there's a lot of things that create differences in the way that people communicate and process and regulate their emotions. So understanding that spectrum, we remember, many of us are lawyers, right? And so we remember in law school, we had this concept that you learned first year torts, I think it was, going back, it's a long time for me, but my first year, I remember thinking, oh, there's this concept about assumption of the risk. Do we all remember that? Assumption of the risk, we remember this in torts. We probably all went home, for those of us in the US, at Thanksgiving after learning about assumption of the risk, and we saw all of these risky behaviors, the turkey, the knife, the whatever, and we thought about assumption of risk. I remember being that annoying law student wanting to talk about all of these concepts. Well, if you know about assumption of the risk, if you're not familiar with the concept, it is basically, if there is a big pit and there's a sign that says don't step in the pit, and then you step in the pit and you get hurt, you've assumed the risk, right? And you can't sue the person who said, hey, here's the pit, I've put a fence around it, don't step in the pit. Well, for this conversation, I wanted you to orient you to a similar concept. It is that assumption is the risk. When you're dealing with people who think and communicate in a different way, assumption is the risk. Because when we make assumptions about the cause of somebody's behavior, that is very risky, especially with those who are neurodivergent. So we need to consider that much of what we think about, much of what we think we know about interpreting other people's actions may be wrong. Now, that requires some unlearning, some reframing. For example, if you are sitting and having a conversation with somebody and they are looking off to the distance, they are not making eye contact with you, they're just, avoiding everything, you might think this person is not engaged in the conversation. This person is maybe not telling me the truth. Maybe this person isn't a good fit if I'm doing an interview for a job. Maybe they're coming across as having a flat affect. So those are things that you may not expect. You may interpret those cues in a way that you feel very strongly. Like I know when somebody's making eye contact with me, it means that they're understanding what I'm saying. Well, that's a strongly held belief, but it also could be very wrong. That demeanor that you see, whether it's eye contact or that behavior, may have much more to do with their discomfort than their disengagement. Or if you're conducting an investigation, or if you're an arbitrator and you're trying to judge credibility, it might be more than their disengagement. It might not be their intent to deceive. It also can be reflective culturally of, it's not respectful to look at somebody in the eye, or it is respectful to look somebody in the eye. So what your work is to consider what actions you can take to ensure that discomfort and your process that your process lowers that level of discomfort. And for those who engage in conflict resolution, there is inherent discomfort. So the work is mitigating that. So you're not making assumptions on when you see behavior that would suggest something. All right. So let's talk about, I'll pause here before I get into any questions from the chat.
Laura, I don't think we have any questions from the chat per se, but I just was going to chime in and say, I thought it was so interesting when you were talking about the work of a mediator is to sort of to pick up on these cues or to identify what's going on. I mean, maybe this is something you'll get to later, but are there some sort of practical tips or techniques that you use to try and not just necessarily identify for yourself, but to verbalize maybe what's going on in the dynamic to the other participants who may not be as aware of these dynamics themselves?
Absolutely. And yes, that is a good segue to our next section, which is what are the things that you need to look for as a mediator? And then we will talk about what type of strategies that I recommend. So let's think about some of the things that I mentioned earlier, these things that would be common characteristics for those who may be neurodivergent, and then what are the implications for you as a mediator? So one of the categories is sensory. This would be a particular sensitivity to light, to sound, to smells, to taste, to touch. Now you can be overstimulated in an environment like I was at the concert last week, or you can be understimulated in the environment. You might be understimulated because I have a low tone voice, and maybe that is lulling you to sleep right now. And you might need some stimulation, whether it's your coffee or something else, to have more stimulation. Now, when you're overstimulated, that also can trigger an emotional response. So you might see that emotional response coming through as repetitive behaviors, something called stimming, which may be physical behaviors or verbal behaviors or motor behaviors, so pacing around. Those stims is to what somebody who's neurodiverse does in order to manage the sensory stimuli. I'll give you the example of my paralegal. She now works from home full time, but when we were in the office, there were many environmental triggers that made it difficult for her to do her best work and to focus. And she said, what she explained to me, everybody has a window of tolerance. So everybody can be overstimulated or understimulated to the point that it's a problem. So people have different windows of tolerance, and it's more than just in the sensory context. It also ties into emotional regulation. It also ties into if they could be overstimulated because you just gave them in your opening statement as a mediator all of this information about your neutrality and about confidentiality and about what's going to happen next. And you might have given them way too much information, and they can become overstimulated by that. Can be overstimulated by the general energy level when it comes to mediation. If you're going to have a marathon mediation and you are in hour 8 and you know that somebody might drop that bomb at the last minute, and there's a sense of fatigue. So while everyone is different, there are a few common characteristics that you may observe when you're meeting with those with neurodivergence. And so sensory is one of them. Processing is another. There are studies that suggest that individuals, and let's take the example of autism, process significantly more information. This doesn't mean they're smarter or faster or that their brains are superior. Just no value judgment. It's really about what I said earlier. It's about their lack of ability to filter. And being able to filter is critical to functioning in our world. Think about what you're filtering right now. And are there sounds in your environment? And if you cannot filter, it is exhausting. I'll give you another example from my paralegal. She has such incredible attention to detail. But she said to me once that, I'm glad that you like my attention to detail, but know that it's going to take me more time and she said, it's like I can't even perceive the forest until I've looked at every single tree. And so what does that mean for you as a mediator? A person who's neurodivergent may struggle processing big picture type of questions, like, what do you want? How do you want this relationship to change? What will happen if we're not able to reach agreement here? What would happen if the judge finds the other person's argument more persuasive? So that could be overwhelming. They might overshare or focus on unnecessary details or on things that you might think is irrelevant as the mediator that could cause you to veer off topic. They might have difficulty organizing and following directions. They might fail, if you ask them to bring your priority list of the things that you want to propose in this mediation and make them in a priority list so we know what are your non-negotiables. They might have difficulty with that. They might have difficulty sequencing events when they're telling you information. So, and some of that is about working memory. So working memory, there can be differences in working memory, but working memory is easy to understand. When you mentally prepare a list before going to the grocery store and you get there and maybe you've forgotten a couple things on your list, that was your working memory. It's the area of the brain where you store bits of information that you plan on using again. So if you're going to make Rice Krispie treats, you're going to the store, you're going to get Rice Krispies, butter, and marshmallows. And then you get to the store and you've forgotten the butter. That was a deficit in your working memory. What does that mean for you as a mediator? So somebody with a difference in working memory might resist participating in conversations because they can't remember what they wanted to say, or they might contact you because they thought of 10 outside the mediation because they thought of 10 more things that they intended to share or they intended to ask for and they didn't. Or at the 8th hour of the mediation, somebody's asking for a new thing. They also might rely on external sources to keep track of their thoughts. So notes or messages on their phone or emails that they might want to check with those resources before answering a question. So I would encourage you to think of processing differences like a different operating system. You could have a Windows system, you can have a Mac system, you can have an iPhone, you can have an Android. And when you need those operating systems to work together, sometimes there are challenges. My kid has an Android phone, I have an iPhone. Sometimes the text messages don't come through the way that I thought they would come through in terms of the timing or things like that. So it's a different operating system, not wrong, different operating system. Another one is, as I mentioned, is emotional regulation. How can that come up in mediation? So this could come up when there's difficulty in shift. So you might want to shift to another topic. There might be an unexpected change in the plan. Maybe you're doing a live mediation and the room that you thought you were going to be in is currently being painted, or I've had this happen, a fire drill in the middle of the mediation. So that you can become very dysregulated from that and not able to re-regulate to and orient to the conflict resolution. There also can be inflexibility where has kind of rigidity of thought. In mediation, it requires us to help people recognizing and accepting that another person has a different point of view. But sometimes individuals who are neurodivergent, they consider their point of view as fact. They also oftentimes have this thing called rejection sensitivity disorder. Rejection sensitivity is what you might think as a very strong or unexpected response to feedback, even when that feedback is constructive. And when a proposal is not accepted, that might create a rejection sensitivity response. So, think about this. We all differ in what it takes for us to reach, let's say, a breaking point. Think about a car alarm. You've been in a parking lot that's full of cars, the alarms are set, and there's, let's say, somebody's trying to break into one of the cars. The car is going to go off. But some car alarms may be triggered by the shopping cart just hitting the bumper. And some car alarms are triggered by high winds, but the alarm is the same. So somebody might get triggered by sensory things in the environment, that perceived rejection. And that's when there's going to be an adrenaline rush, but the impact is the same. The alarm of the car is still the same, and it's going to take the car alarm to go through that cycle to recover. It's just a different trigger, a different level. Another common characteristic is differences in communication. Many people generally have an intrinsic understanding of social rules or norms of a conversation. So I speak and then you speak, and then knowing what kind of answer is required by a question, staying on topic, not changing topic. But there might be differences in that and challenges in that area, and individuals may not communicate in ways that we expect. They could appear blunt or abrupt or have a flat affect. They might not understand figurative language, metaphors, sarcasm, and they might become fixated on a particular topic. So your language use, you have to be really careful about how you use language. You might want to be super conversational and say things like, let's not get wrapped around the axle of that particular topic. You might want to say, well, we need to land the plane, or you might say, what? If you want to tell me these things, I'm all ears. Well, think about that literally. If you are a literal thinker, that's kind of, I'm going to keep my eyes on you. Ooh, that's kind of, that's disturbing, those images. So we want to make sure that we understand the different ways of communicating could impact how we are talking to folks and how we are giving messages that they understand. And then finally, social interaction. So as I mentioned earlier, that eye contact is not, whether they're making eye contact or not making eye contact, that is not a reliable indicator of credibility. There's also a term called masking or social camouflage, which is a strategy that individuals who are neurodivergent try to do so that they appear that they're not neurodivergent. So they're masking. So if you say, did you understand that? They might just say yes, because they don't want to appear that they needed you to explain it in a different way. They might lose track of time. That's called time blindness. They might have justice sensitivity, which is a strong sense of fairness, equity, and a need to correct wrongdoing. That might be a more intense focus on correcting that injustice, and they may get stuck on that. So this can create challenges in mediation, especially when, let's say somebody has decided, we didn't do anything wrong, but we want to make a settlement offer so that we can stop the litigation. If somebody has a strong justice-seeking mentality, they might really get stuck on that and not want to make a settlement offer because they want to, they're clearly not going to divert from the, I need to correct this wrongdoing. I didn't do anything wrong. And so it could go on both sides. So why is this important? Well, it's important because there's a high prevalence and it's increasing. The statistics suggest 15 to 20% of the population identify as neurodivergent, but that is growing. It's also underdiagnosed, untreated, and undisclosed because people want to mask. And it's important because people make assumptions about capacity and need and credibility. It's also important for mediators because of all the things that mediation requires: communication skills and ability to take other people's perspectives and engaging socially and regulating your emotions. So I'll stop here because I'm going to talk about those strategies while we still have some time, but I'll pause if there's any questions. And if it's about strategies, I will answer those questions in the next section.
Okay, well, we do have a lot of questions now coming in, Laura. So here's one from Tim. Do you recommend attempting to learn before mediation whether any of the parties are neurodivergent and the nature of their limitations? And tied in with that is a question from Alice. Can you ask participants up front if they have any communication preferences?
So those are great segues because I am going to talk about these strategies, and that is inclusive of that. So how about we wait on after the strategies, because I might cover most of the questions in the next section.
Okay, then how about this question? How would you address the behavior to learn more about what it's related to, and thus how you can best communicate and support?
I'm gonna anticipate, I'm gonna predict that a lot of the questions I'm going to answer. So we're going to move
Okay.
on. Yep. So what I would suggest to you is you consider a universal design approach. Okay. And what I will tell you there is when the ramp that you build for one is the pathway for many. What I'm going to tell you now is things that you can do across the board to make your process more neuro-inclusive. And it will be more effective, more consistent, more effective, and for mediators, ding ding, more neutral. Here are I'm going to talk about some strategies, some interventions that you can use in your mediation process. Those are at the base level, some systemic efforts, which is going to be about whether there's a disclosure up front, some inclusive strategies, and some individual supports when things might get off track. So some systemic efforts is what you're doing today, getting some training, understanding your language use, thinking about the written communication that you send to parties, how the word choice, the format, the fonts that you use, are they inclusive? But also think about in your initial outreach to the parties, you can say things like, I want to make this an inclusive process for everybody, including if you have any needs that arise from a disability, arise from neurodivergence, cultural issues that I need to know about as a mediator. And so not inviting them to disclose a disability, but inviting them to disclose what they might need in your process that would make it more productive for them. Communicating in both verbally and in writing, multimodal communication, because for somebody with working memory, they might not remember it when after it's been said or after it's been written. And then there's a high need for predictability. And so making sure that you are very clear in your agenda and your directions. We are going to be meeting here. It's in this room. It has this kind of setup. We are going to be meeting from this time to this time. That need for predictability is high. And so again, the ramp that you build for one can become the pathway for many, because I like to have clear instructions. I like to have, communication that doesn't have a lot of jargon. I like to have a clear agenda so the process is predictable. A second level tier, these are inclusive strategies, is what I mentioned earlier, is describing the logistics, describing that people will have a break. So if they become overstimulated in the environment or overwhelmed by the large group or small group, those social nuances can be overstimulating. And so that you have the ability to break up into caucus, that you have the ability to have somebody in their own separate space. Also talk about that there may be multiple sessions of this particular mediation. And then consider previewing the topics or the questions. So because they need to understand that there may be time constraints and that working in advance may be helpful to engaging fully when you're in the mediation session. The other thing that I would ask you to do when you are either in physical spaces or virtual spaces is to consider the sensory needs. If you are in a room or in two rooms that you have as for caucus session, look at the lighting. Is there a visual clutter? Can you see somebody outside or hear somebody outside? Is there a clock ticking? Is there fluorescent lights? My paralegal really hated the fluorescent lights because all she could hear was the buzz of the fluorescent lights. Did somebody just have Indian takeout in the room that you're using or did somebody just have the cleaning crew come through? And so there's a strong smell in that room. Is there a place that might be soft seating or hard seating? And then consider that for many who are neurodivergent, they don't want to be touched. And so starting off with a handshake may be very triggering for them. So I never do that. And I always lead with allowing the person to come in. And if they want to shake hands, I follow their lead. Then thinking about, do you need some snacks or water, mints in the environment? So take a sensory audit. And if you can't adjust, if there's something that is a sensory trigger, maybe think about if there's an alternate setting where folks could go if they want to decompress or to recover. So individual supports. One of the things that I like to do is acknowledge the stress and the emotions that are inherent in mediation. I'd like to say, this can be an unpredictable process and it relies on our ability to deal with conflict. So what I ask is not asking them to disclosing a disability. I might ask, what might you need, given that it's stressful, what might you need to, sustain your attention, to organize your thoughts, to generate ideas? And, if you get overwhelmed by this, because a lot of people do, it's conflict, it's not fun, what might it look like to me that you need support? And then what could I do to help you get back on track? So for many, traditional rapport building is viewed as not something that they want to engage in. So if you want to come and say, hey, it's great weather today, how are you doing today? How was your drive on the way? For many who are neurodivergent, they're like, I'm here, like what's on my mind is the conflict. Don't talk to me about the weather and things like that. So that rapport building could be off-putting. You could do rapport building in a different way. You can say, this can be stressful. What are the things that help you focus? What are the things that I can do as a mediator? And if we get off track, what are the things that I can do to get back on track? Thinking about how you ask questions. You might need to deviate from that. A lot of times, either in mediations or in investigations, we start with that funnel approach where we just allow them to give their narrative and then we ask more targeted questions. That may not be effective because that narrative might start with 5 years ago. You might need to be more direct with your questions, and you might need to assist in evaluating positions and interests and reality testing alternatives. You might need to help facilitate flexible thinking and help see that somebody is, that you monitor them and say, I'm wondering, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed in the environment in this engagement. Would you like to take a break? I think I might want to take a break, and set some meeting norms. You can set those meeting norms about managing interrupting, because some individuals who are neurodivergent find it challenging to provide uninterrupted space. They want to chime in. And so some of the common challenges is when individuals are uncomfortable, when they're under distress, when they're engaging in these detours of going down the rabbit hole. That was a figure of speech, right? I'm not really going down the rabbit hole, but if I was somebody who's neurodivergent, I probably would think about trying to fit my body into a rabbit hole, right? So they're going off topic. They may appear disengaged, or they might be delaying the process and not moving as quickly as you might think. They might experience that rejection sensitivity. And so thinking about that as a mediator, that's going to be the work, that you have to recognize that this is happening and have some strategies to address it. So before I go to some of these takeaways, I want to go back to some of the questions that we had about specifics. And I will let Jean or David filter those.
Okay, here's an interesting one since you answered those other questions in the presentation. Thank you. What does it look like to communicate our own neurodiversity to participants as a mediator?
I would say things like, if if you understand the ways that you process and communicate and you understand those to be different, you could say things like, what is helpful for me is that I take a lot of notes. And so I process things by writing it down. I would be talking about it not necessarily from the context of I am neurodivergent, although if that's comfortable for you, but not everybody understands that concept. Not everybody relates to that terminology. But it's really about how you're showing up and how you communicate. So for example, I might say, in this setting, I can be distracted by two people talking at the same time. Or in this setting, I need to be able to focus in this way. So can you help me by X, Y, and Z? That might create a space and an openness for the other person to say, hey, you know what? I'm being triggered by these fluorescent lights, or I'm really distracted by the conversation that's happening out in the hall. So I would be framing it just like you would, we don't talk about our positions, we talk about our needs in mediation and our interests. I would be talking about our needs and interests in that context.
That's a great solution, because that's just plain English and one human talking to another about how to make this happen. Thank you. Here's an interesting observation, really more than a question. Maybe you'd have something to add to it here. My college daughter now offers, quote, "It's not that I'm not inviting you, Mom. It's not, wait, it's not that I'm not inviting you, Mom. It's just that I think it would be overstimulating for you," as a way of, speaking.
Yeah, that's a nice way to honor that the person understands those needs that are underlying the behavior.
Right. What do you suggest for a situation where the person has not gotten as far as being able to identify their needs, especially in the context of mediation?
Well,
Example, a younger person.
as as a mediator, and because of my disability practice, a lot of the mediations that I have are that come in through our consulting company. If somebody believes that somebody has a disability or neurodivergent, they come to me. So I think I have a disproportionate number of folks who think and process in a different way because of my background. But I can tell you that when I'm not in those situations, it's difficult for people who are not neurodivergent often to come up with their interests and their needs. And so it would be the same thing that we do with any other mediation, is to trying to get underneath the behavior and trying to figure out what concrete things are underlying what they want, what their position is, and trying to see if there's alignment. Because oftentimes we find that there's alignment on both sides, and that's the work of our job as mediators. But we have to understand that we might need to go a little bit deeper when people don't have the facility to bring that to the forefront in a concrete way.
Yeah, it's interesting. In a workplace, how do you handle a team where one neurodivergent team member has accommodations and the other team members resent that?
So I think understanding what we've talked about today is really helpful to being a neuro-inclusive team. It's not that one team member is getting an advantage. It's that the other team member that is either getting an accommodation, and maybe it's that they are in a different room that doesn't have the fluorescent light. They're getting something so that they can do their job. And so it's like anything else where people perceive that somebody is getting something that is an unfair advantage. It's about training and broadening that lens about how different people think and process and communicate. I have found that whether or not I'm training a global brand, or I'm training a local school, or I'm training a large team or a small team, people want to do better. They want to be inclusive. They just don't know how. And so I think that having these kinds of conversations, being open, being understanding that people do have differences in the way that they process and communicate, helps build that bridge from those good intentions to that true inclusion. But it's just really navigating those expectations and those misunderstandings about this topic that might build that bridge in the situation that you brought up, Jean.
Yeah, and you first started talking about assumptions at the beginning of the presentation here, and one of the attendees here commented that he would expect to be super careful to not make an assumption there, a power differential between the parties if one party has an obvious neurodiversity, situation.
Absolutely. And you can't assume that somebody who is distracted, let's say somebody's distracted and they're not being able to they're not able to focus and they're not able to, and they might say, you know what, I'm sorry, I'm just really distracted today, or I'm having a real hard time concentrating. Another assumption that you can't make is that they either are neurodivergent or that they identify as having a disability. I mean, they could have had, and I talked to David and Jean about this. I mean, they could have been on a red eye last night, and or they could be, and you can see I have gray hair. I'm a woman of a certain age. They could be having a hot flash in that moment. I mean, and their brain is going offline. So you cannot make an assumption that even if the behavior that you're seeing, oh, you know what, I just took this training from Laura Anthony, and I learned about ADHD, and I learned about inability to filter and focus, that must mean that they're neurodivergent. No, that is an assumption that you cannot make. You can say, if somebody says, I'm feeling really distracted, you can say, tell me a little bit more about that. Is there a way that I can help? Is there a way that this is being presented versus, oh, so I'm really good with neuro inclusion. I've been trained on neuro inclusion. Just don't jump to that conclusion.
Sounds good. Boy, the questions are just coming in now. This is great. As long as you're still willing to take the time to answer. How do you educate and inform the other parties? If you even do, that's my question, I would tie in with that, about the neurodiverse considerations you have observed. How do you respectfully translate this to help facilitate resolution?
So again, I really go back to talking about needs and interests and what's underlying. But just like anything in mediation, I'm going to get consent before I tell the other party anything that has been disclosed to me. And so sometimes I will ask, if somebody says, well, the reason that I was standing so close to the other person is that I am autistic and I have difficulty understanding where I need to be in space, it's a workplace conflict. I would say, is there something that I can share about that? What is your comfort level about that? So it just be with like any other information that you receive in a caucus session, that you would need to have a dialogue about what you can and cannot share and where the comfort level is.
Yeah, just basic human interaction, right? On that. How might you handle oversharing and an emotional spiral?
So when there is a detour, when there's somebody's going off on a tangent or oversharing, what I would inquire is, I'd say, thank you for sharing that. Can you help me understand how this connects to that issue in dispute? So it's just a gentle redirect, a reflection and a redirection. Don't assume that it's not relevant. I wouldn't use the word relevant either, but I would just say, tell me about the connection here. Because there may be a connection if they're oversharing something that may be, and I'm thinking that the overshare is just more information than you need. And the emotional, I think there was a question about it, the emotional spiral. This is when you would be, hopefully in advance, you would have said, hey, this can be a stressful situation. It can be, I've done hundreds of mediations. People come to mediation with a whole host of different responses. Sometimes people are angry and sometimes people are scared, and sometimes people are nervous or sad. And so what I want to make sure that is, if any emotions come up, that they don't become an obstacle. So how can I help you if things become emotional? Redirect so that we can, stay on track. And they might say, you know what, I might need to take a break, or I might need a glass of water, or I might need to go talk to my support person. And then so if there is an emotional spiral, you can go and reflect back on, you know what, this seems like a situation where we need to take a break, or do whatever it was that they said they might need to get re-regulated. So I like to head it off in my initial conversation as a mediator so that I can redirect back if things, if somebody is in distress.
Yeah. What about, if as the mediator, you're working in a place, for example, a prison, a courthouse, heck, Zoom in your den, your family room or something. But there you would have control. But if you're working where you have no control over the ambiance and the lighting, the snacks, the sounds, all these different kinds of things, how would you approach those situations? And any suggestions you might have?
When you're not in control, what I would do, if is to say, help people anticipate that, so that understanding where the setting is that you're not in control, so that individuals can anticipate and can tell you what they might need. So they might need to bring they might, in a prison, they might not have access, but some people bring fidget items or sensory tools because they know it's going to be an overwhelming environment. When I went to that concert, there were people who had headphones on because they knew that auditorily that would be overstimulating. People might have fidgets or things that they use. And so I would just be I'd be open, and I would be clear as to what the setting is going to look like. So the takeaways here is that we want to make sure that we are thinking differently about thinking differently, and that these different ways of thinking aren't just something to accommodate, they're something to actually anticipate. Because when you recognize that great minds don't think alike, and when you recognize that making assumptions is risky, and that the ramp that you build for one can help your entire mediation, you understand how being neuroinclusive can lead to better outcomes in your dispute resolution practice. So the big takeaway is when we anticipate and we support those different ways of thinking, it can completely change the way that you connect with others as a neutral. And it also can completely change the results that you get when you do that. So those are the threshold concepts that I wanted to review. That, again, as I mentioned initially, there's certainly so much more that we could talk about from, somebody asked about the, if-thens. I do push out a lot of content on LinkedIn. But I am particularly interested in these assumptions that we make. And so in my neutral practice, I am an investigator, and I'm a hearing officer, and I am a mediator. And just neurodiversity is just a really important topic if you also wear those other neutral roles, and just to be thinking about beyond your mediation, if you're making credibility determinations as a hearing officer or as a investigator, what are those assumptions that you make? And can you set those assumptions aside and just go to that level down and ask questions? There was a question earlier, Jean, that we put off, and asking, how do you know what's underneath? You just ask. Help me understand, help me understand why this response. This wasn't something I anticipated. It would be helpful for me to better understand that. So I would love to hear a little bit more about why you made that statement, or why you engaged in that way, so that I can help us through the process. Just ask, and being open and willing to hear the response is half the work. So I know that there are 2 more minutes. Is there any questions that you have that I didn't answer? I know that there's like 99 plus questions, so I
know. There are several questions. How to pick the right ones here for the time. Could we mistake interaction with a person who has a deficit in emotional intelligence for neurodivergence?
Emotional intelligence, I think what you're asking about, are you asking, I would need to know a little bit more about that question. Is it an intellectual disability? Because when somebody says emotional intelligence, I wasn't sure if it was like an intellectual disability. So if somebody has an intellectual disability, there certainly are similar strategies that are used in terms of being able to process things and communicate. So similar strategies, but not as much of the sensory and the social communication, but very similar strategies.
Great. Are there cases where an individual maybe uses a personal coach in the mediation? Have you seen
Well,
this?
I mean, I've seen a lot of people who are bringing their support persons and their attorneys, and they're acting like coaches, so, I don't think it's any different than somebody who's bringing an advisor or a support person. I always like to have a support person in the mediation anyway. And so if folks want a second set of eyes, or somebody who can broaden their perspective on how to think through conflict, I always find that to be tremendously valuable.
Yeah, and lots of people have their pets, especially, when we're on Zoom and they're at home, not necessarily because of neurodivergence, but just because it makes them feel good and comfortable. And it certainly is a nice way to, to cut through, the initial, just to break the ice, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been great having you here, Laura. Thank you so much. I know I follow you on LinkedIn and have for a long time. I love what you put out there. And out of those 99 or however many chat things there are here, which you will get a copy of and receive, so many of them are saying thank you so much. So kudos and thank you so much from all of us for the work you do. And thank you for being on Will Work for Food. We'd love to have you back again sometime, certainly. And, as I like to say about Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour, certainly it's like feed your mind while you're feeding the world. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So everyone, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for whatever contributions you might make to Laura's Food Bank and or to the food bank in your local neighborhood. And then please let one of us know, Natalie, myself, David, Jeff Kachavan, one of us, or go to the website willworkforfood.news and you can click on a link there and tell us how much. And we'll be thrilled to add it to our running total. We're looking to hit $1 million. Some of us have bet we'll get there before the end of the year. Others of us thinking it'll be after. So whatever it is you can do, and thank you for any time you donate as well. A lot of people donate time at food banks. So have a great day, everyone. Same time, same place, different Zoom link next week. Take care. Bye-bye.